Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest, Blair Levin, who has had a number of jobs within the government and outside the government, and is an expert in communications policy. We're going to delve into a bunch of different issues today, and really excited about this conversation. Blair, thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you. Great to see you.
So let's start with an easy question, and we'll build our way up. Can you provide a little bit of a background on yourself and how you got to your current position with New Street Research?
Yeah, so grew up in California, came back east for college and law school, fell in love with a woman who decided to do her medical degree in North Carolina. So I practiced law in North Carolina for 10 years, actually doing corporate finance, something which does not really show up on my resume, but actually turns out to have been really good training for understanding certain things that proved valuable both at the FCC and in other places. And then came to the FCC due to a friendship with the new chair, Reed Hunt. And then I got to New Street I got to Legg Mason, and then I went to Stifel, and I went to Equity Research after I left the job as Chief of Staff of the FCC. And importantly, after the first Spectrum auctions, after the Digital Television Initiative, after the implementation of the '96 Act, and the rise of the Internet. And all of those things, there were a variety of ways that my knowledge and expertise could have been valuable. In a bizarre way, I lucked into the analyst role, which is fundamentally trying to distinguish noise and signal in terms of what policy does that affects capital markets. Because it turns out, both in terms of what I enjoy doing and what I'm good at, I was a very successful lawyer, but I'm not sure I was a good one. And I'm delighted to do analysis, which is more to my liking.
Are there many companies that function as competitors to New Street, or is it more of a specialized market?
There are a lot of companies that do equity research. New Street does telecom. We do a little bit of media. We do a lot of tech, a lot of internet, and there are lots and lots of equity research shops. In policy, when I started this, there were a number of people doing what I do. As the telecom sector has become less important to the indexes, and it is dramatically less important, and policy, the changes in policy have frankly become less important. There are fewer and fewer people doing what I do. But look, there's a lot of law firms that do what I do. There's plenty of competition. One nice thing about Wall Street, from my perspective, is if a corporation hires a lawyer, they hire a lead lawyer. In terms of intelligence, Wall Street hires lots of people. So if you're good, you get hired, as do your friends who are doing the same thing. So you compete, but it's very different than competing for kind of a single position.
What is it you say you do for New Street Research? What is the role of an analyst? Is that a lot of writings? Is it talking to investors directly? What's the scope of your?
Yeah, I would characterize it as an ongoing conversation, sometimes written, sometimes over Zoom, sometimes in conference rooms in Midtown Manhattan and Boston and San Francisco, just discussing what is the meaning of things in terms of how you project out the next quarter, the next couple of years, the next 5 to 10 years. Look, there's lots of data points. Another great thing about Wall Street from my perspective is that every day people have to rethink their priors, because every day a stock goes up or down, and every day there's news that affects whether in the future that stock will go up and down. So it's very different than the DC environment, in which if somebody says, I was wrong about it then and now I believe X, whatever, everybody gets something wrong on Wall Street. Nobody bats 1,000. In DC, and there's no cost, I don't think, to admitting error. Whereas in DC, very few people ever admit error. Trump wears a hat that says Trump was right about everything. If a CEO of a Fortune 500 company ever wore a hat saying, I was right about everything, they would tank his stock, because it shows a certain kind of arrogance and narcissism and inability to incorporate new data that means that company's going down. So I like that environment in which we're dealing with probabilities, in which we have to constantly rethink things. And that's fundamentally my job. I do a lot of writing, but the most fun part is sitting in a room with 9 investors peppering me with questions and challenging me. Because, just as with a trade, there's almost inevitably somebody on the other side of everything I say.
Well, that gets an interesting question. There are many types of investors. Some do long, some do short, some do distressed. Is there a typical audience of investors that you're speaking to? Is it long, or is it everybody? Is this mad?
This is a really interesting question, and the answer is it changes over time. When I started doing this in 2001, nearly 100% of my clients were long. They were equity, they were going long. I spend a huge amount of time now talking to credit investors. Now, part of that is because Dish, from a Wall Street perspective, is the most important company where you have an intersection of policy and capital markets. AT&T is just not that affected by it. I mean, in a little bit we can chat about that. Dish, very significantly affected by policy. And so, and a large percentage of the people who have an interest in Dish are not holding their equity, they're holding their debt. So these days, but by the way, this is also true again, and a big change from 2001, the credit side of the telecom companies and the media companies is much more important than it was 24 years ago.
Are you judged by your wins and losses in the sense of how you make calls on what may happen based on the policy that's in play? I think of a piece you wrote a long while back, a little bit ago, on the exposure to telecom companies for, I'll call it lead pipe exposure.
Yeah.
And you made a call, and I got a bunch of calls asking me what was the ramifications of your call.
Yeah. So first of all, I probably care more about the judgment of my children, and I will just say that every time a call gets dropped on their cell phone, they go, "Dad, what did you do?" And there are other judgments I care more about, to be honest. But absolutely, you get judged every day. Now, I have made some mistakes. One of my favorite things is to be on the panel in Washington where inevitably somebody says, "You can't predict the future." And I say, "Really?" Because I've been paid pretty well for the last 2 decades to do exactly that. I'm not saying I can predict it with 100% accuracy. I am saying that every day trillions of dollars exchange hands because people have different views of what the future is, but they are predicting it. And so it is my job to predict 2 things. One is what will happen and its impact on the companies, but the second is what is my level of confidence. Wall Street understands there are high conviction things, like I have very high conviction that CAR will change the local and national ownership caps. Very high conviction. I had that in November of 24, right? This is not a mystery. There are at least 3 things, and they're very painful to me, where I did get it wrong. One, the Wall Street Journal story on the lead exposure of the companies was an interesting one. Story came out on a Sunday night. Monday morning, I published a piece saying, here is the range of possibilities. I quickly followed that up by saying, at the end of the day, even if found liable, I don't think the companies are ever going to have to pay because the government's going to have to bail them out. But, that was a very confusing time. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I believed the Wall Street Journal reporters in their story because they're very good reporters. The Journal, I have had issues with the editorial page, but the journalists are very, very good. And I could not understand why they would write something if they didn't have backup. And so we spent a couple weeks going through that, and within a few weeks we softened our views on what the impact would be, and now I think the impact is, and we followed up with some state stuff, and they didn't make the findings. So, but I got the Tegna deal wrong. I thought Jessica would approve the deal with various conditions. I got the U.S. Court wrong on the T-Mobile Sprint deal. I thought the states would win. And in that one in particular, there was some conversation in camera, which means not public, with the judge. There was, the judge's decision, that was very influential. But yeah, you could lose. I mean, I haven't, people often fired me because I have a long track record, but you can lose your job. The single biggest call I ever made was in 2002, could have been 2003, but it had to do with, would the FCC overturn the unbundled network element platform rules of my own time, of really the Reed Hunt, Bill Kennard time. And the question was, would Kevin Martin go along with Chairman Powell, or would he go with the two Democrats? I said he would go with the two Democrats. My largest competitor, a guy named Scott Cleland, who's a very smart and able guy, Republican, but he had done a lot of very good work, said that Martin would go along with Powell. And on that day, Scott's clients gave my clients, there was basically an exchange of $60 billion. There will never be another day where I do that. But Scott, who had his own independent firm, that firm basically went out of business because of the extent of that error. Scott could have been right. This was an odd call because Kevin had said he was voting with the Democrats, and Scott's view was, well, he says that now, but he's going to fold. I know Kevin. I didn't think he was bluffing. So anyway, but my point is, yeah, there are a lot of people, if you make bad calls, you can lose your job. Having said that, Wall Street, the institutional investors, they're very, very smart. They do a lot of work. They don't really hire us to make the judgment about what stocks to buy and sell. They're really hiring us for a variety of things, but it's like a second opinion. And in my case, it's kind of it's a combination of history and dynamics and lots of different things. And I have a lot of clients I've known for literally decades. And, if I make a big mistake, yeah, I could get fired. But they're really judging me over the body of work, I think.
Does it change your analysis of how strongly you present? I'm not saying you ever have, but if you had 3 wrong in a row, do you write something that's a little bit softer with a little bit more wiggle room, or do you find yourself able to make tough calls no matter what the circumstance?
Yeah,
and play it out.
I just think you play it out. You get up, you go to bat every day, you try to hit the ball. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. And again, the culture of Wall Street is not 100%, because every day the best investors make a mistake. Whether you're in the fullness of time on any given day, the decision to buy, sell, or hold turns out to be wrong in the fullness of time. So having said that, if I say I have high conviction that something will happen and here's why I believe it, and then it turns out that I missed incredibly obvious, important evidence, I think my job could be in trouble.
How do you pick the subjects or the topics or the specific deals? How do you pick which ones you write about? And is it because of the inquiries you're getting from investors? Or is it, hey, I think this, in my experience, says this is an important topic, it's going to drive this year's agenda in one form or fashion, whether it be tech or telecom, and either I'm going to write it and let people...
Yeah, it's both. I mean, I get a lot of incoming news breaks. I get a lot of, anytime I get, 3 or more questions, I'm writing about it. On the other hand, one of the disciplines of my job is to constantly be thinking, what's underappreciated? What are people on Wall Street not caring about that they should be caring about?
And do you have investors, hey, I really want you to write this piece, or they rather I want your insight, but I don't want you to tell the rest of the world what you think?
One of the interesting things about Wall Street is, of course, everyone would rather have me be on an exclusive basis, but no one would pay me enough to make it worthwhile. And this would be true of every equity research shop. Yeah, and a lot of times I write something and then I get follow-up calls, or we do a big call with a group of investors and stuff like that. Wall Street, it's just it's like a giant spy ring in the Cold War. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody is saying things to various people. One of the interesting things I learned when I was starting off was there were certain people who called me up to tell me rumors about things going on in Washington in an effort to get me to write something. And I had to be very conscious. I remember during a deal, somebody called up and said, oh, the DOJ is about to approve a deal that I thought they were going to reject. And if I had written that, A, it would have been an error, and B, it would have caused, a lot of churn. So it's a complicated relationship. For the most part, I think it's a lot of fun and really interesting, but there's definitely problematic sides to it.
So this may be a little provocative, and I don't mean it to be, but you're a very prominent Democrat in a Republican government at the moment.
Yeah.
Things can obviously change depending on elections.
Yeah.
Does that make it more difficult or easier depending on which administration's in authority to get insight, not insider information, but insight into what may happen, right? You can visualize what a Democrat may do, and maybe a Republican is a little bit, farther away from your mindset. Is that come into play at all?
No. Michael, but here's a serious question for you. Do you think Republicans are mysterious about what they're going to do?
It depends on the issue, like how they approach certain things, and others I think are very, crystal clear that maybe not everyone sees them.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Look, let me tell you about the two most significant notes I think I wrote this year for investors. I've written lots of different things. The biggest issues for investors in the year 2025 so far has been about Dish. In May, I think May 9th, Carr wrote a letter to Charlie Ergen saying, we're starting these two proceedings. And I wrote a note saying, here are the two proceedings. Here's what the outcome of the proceedings will be if we ever get that far. If they were to go to court and Ergen were to challenge, Ergen would win both of them. But that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that Carr is putting Ergen in a position where he cannot do the refinancing necessary in the second quarter of 26, so he will be forced to sell spectrum. And that's what turned out. Did I need any inside information from Carr? No. Or any other Republican? No. Here's a second one. The Department of Justice approves the T-Mobile U.S. Cellular deal. But in doing so, issues a 900-word summary of why they approved it, but also stating a lot of concerns about spectrum aggregation among the top three wireless guys. That caused huge consternation on Wall Street. Not at all about T-Mobile or US Cellular. It was, oh my God, can Dish sell its spectrum to AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile? Because if they can't, then the value is much less than we had thought. And I wrote a note saying, I believe the head of the antitrust division, Gail Slater, who's a very fine person, was supporting her staff, who pushed to have EchoStar get certain things when they were approving the T-Mobile Sprint deal. But at the end of the day, she can't block them from selling to, because there are no options. The only option really is cable. Cable's not interested, maybe private equity, but I doubt it. So I went through the analysis. And as we can see with the reaction to Dish selling to AT&T, the DOJ will look at it, but they're going to allow it. So neither of those things required knowledge of the Republicans. And again, the example going back to 2003, it wasn't that Kevin Martin privately told me, people think I'm bluffing, I'm not bluffing. He said that publicly, So it was my measure of Kevin versus Scott's measure of Kevin. It's not really an inside thing.
Maybe ask the question a little differently. Is there presentations where the companies will ask for, or do they seek out, your firm and then 5 different firms, and they may say, oh, this one is maybe more Republican leaning, and then they take all that data in, not that you can't analyze what Republicans are doing, but they get a picture based on who the people may be. Is that a way to look upon it? I think of, and I suggested before we started, there was a conference coming up, and all of the conferees from the investment conference to be had were all Democrats.
Yeah.
And I thought that was unique, and I didn't, it's not.
Yeah, I've done those kind of conferences. They're always mixed Dems and Republicans. I would simply say, I think when it comes to predicting elections or predicting macro kinds of things, like what are the Democrats going to do about the shutdown, there may be a value to institutional investors to have a Republican consultant and a Democratic consultant. I think when you come to areas of expertise where policy matters, trade policy is maybe the largest one this year. And by the way, another piece I wrote early on was I thought the tariffs had a significant legal problem, which I think proves out to be true. It had nothing to do with being Republican or Democrat. In fact, that litigation is being pushed by very conservative Republicans. It just had to do with legal analysis. I think if healthcare is huge in terms of policy, there are a variety of ones. I don't think being a Democrat or Republican matter. I think, do you have the expertise? Do you have the network of contacts to understand what is going on? And can you translate what is often Washington rhetoric, which is very divorced from Wall Street reality, into Wall Street reality?
All right, when you prepare...
Can I give you an example? So Carr successfully gets Ergen to sell the spectrum. 2 big deals, one to AT&T, a second one to SpaceX. Carr says, this is going to be great for competition. SpaceX is going to be the new 4th facilities-based competitor to bring greater competition than ever. I won't criticize Carr for saying that. I will just say, I doubt it. and pretty much everyone on Wall Street doubts it. There's been no material change. If anybody believed it, you would see a material change in AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile stock. You would see a bunch of other things. You're not seeing those. Here's another one. Carr said the CBS litigation with Trump has nothing to do with my review of the Skydance deal. I said the Skydance deal will be approved after CBS writes a check. So in other words, there's a translation issue. But I don't think that's about Democrats and Republicans. It's about the ability to both perceive what reality is and then translate various things in D.C. to their meaning on Wall Street.
Well, I should say I don't have any involvement any viewpoint on the chairman, so to your point. But when you prepare to write something,
I think he's a very consequential chairman. I would say that.
When you prepare to write something, can you just sit down, talk to a few folks, and write it, or are you almost not acting, or are you performing and making a bunch of calls, kind of almost like a information gatherer or reporter kind of?
Yeah, no, it is similar to a journalist job, in that at the end of the day, you have to be able to write for an audience that can read it. I write in a certain way that you can read it in 2 or 3 minutes, you can read it in 5 to 10 minutes, you can read it in 20 minutes. And there's a very specific reason I do it that way. But it is very much like a journalist. I outline what I think are the key things that investors have to understand about this particular thing that happened. I have lots of friends. I am very grateful to my friends. I often send drafts. This is actually a little bit problematic for fundamental analysts who might be saying, as a result of X, I'm going to make, buy, sell, hold, whatever, but change our position. You don't want to circulate those to people ahead of time. My stuff is more analytic, it's longer term, and therefore, my talking to various folks and getting feedback is part of what I do. That part is a lot like a journalist, but it's also like a lawyer in that I read a lot of court cases and stuff like that.
Do you find it, when you're making policy analysis and opinions on what may happen, do you find your personal views engaged in that? There are a lot of issues over the years that you may have had personal positions on. You mentioned the case earlier where the UNEP and potentially undoing the work of your own work. I've found those cases. It happened to me. Does that become difficult, or is it you do the job?
Oh, you just do the job. I think of myself. Let me tell you 2 things. First of all, I think of myself. I grew up in Los Angeles, so I'm kind of like a former LA Dodger who's now become a sports writer and has to both predict and analyze the game. And I was a Dodger, but That's not what I do anymore. That's not what people pay me for. There are some issues. I've had an affiliation with Brookings, Aspen. I do some writing. You just have to understand the game. And I think, though, correct me if I'm wrong, and others can correct me, you might guess what I believe about a policy, but it may well be wrong. But I never, in these notes, say this policy is good or it is bad. I will simply say, I think this policy is likely to be adopted and its impact will be X.
So do you find that with other analysts that you, I would say compete with, but that are in this space and you know each other, you just mentioned. But, I think of like Tom Brady, who's an announcer, but he also, has his, views, and he's kind of, the question is he helping his team, or that the Commanders have announcers that they want to lean a certain way, or they want to bounce them. Are you try to play it straight up?
I'm just trying to play it straight up. There's another thing, and I might note that, first of all, I am by nature always doubtful that I'm right. That is just part of my character. Secondly, I'm a deep believer, even though I think I've been right a lot, I could be wrong, and it's really important to keep that in mind. The second thing is, I'm a deep believer in the debate. One of the best things that I did when I was chief of staff was I spoke to the Progress and Freedom Foundation. Randy May, who I guess in a way is a sponsor of this, was at Progress and Freedom then, and Randy is an old friend, and I read everything he writes for this reason. When I went to those meetings, Progress and Freedom really disagreed with a lot of the stuff we were doing. I argued with them, and I thought they were wrong. But they did raise various issues which made me say, well, we should keep doing X, but we should not do Y. This is a mistake. I am very grateful for that, and I continue to read Randy and other folks, because nobody gets all the wisdom. And in different circumstances, a conservative or a liberal point of view would be right. I might note, by the way, I would say the Trump administration has brought out my inner Hayek. That is to say, I read Hayek in college and read a lot of stuff in college. In my opinion, this is an incredibly regulatory administration, which, by the way, I totally predicted. And the reason for that is that Trump, as a matter of his personality, wants to replace the free market with the market for his affections. And you see this with tariffs, and you see this with visas, and you see this in a variety of different ways. And frankly, you see it at the FCC in terms of what they are trying to do to change the media content. You can argue about many things, but Brendan says, Trump attacked the media, and I'm going to carry out that agenda. And in his view, he's making it more fair. In other people's view, he's making it more biased. But my point is, it's about the market for Trump's affections. That is not a conservative principle. And so, I had no problem, and I think Michael Powell and Kevin Martin would agree with this, I had no problem describing what they were doing without ever criticizing them for what they were doing, even if I disagreed with it. The funniest one, by the way, is net neutrality, where I pretty early on believed it was no longer relevant to the market and started writing that. But the issue kept coming up. So I had to write something. But my basic take was, you could do this, you could do that, does it matter? I'm fairly well read on Wall Street, but the piece that I wrote that got the most readership and may in a way be the most influential was a piece I did with my friend Larry Downs, who's a brilliant business strategist and a libertarian. And it's kind of like Larry and I developed a friendship, and we figured, hey, if you and I agree on something, it's probably true. And we wrote a piece, we've written a bunch of pieces for the Harvard Business Review, and one on how Google Fiber was the most successful policy initiative and the biggest business failure at the same time. And the reason I mentioned that in the context of net neutrality was, in a structural way, it kind of solved the problem. If you have fast enough networks, there's just no incentive to discriminate. And so anyway, that heavily influenced, and by the way, Google Fiber came out of the National Broadband Plan that I worked on, and so it was something where it wasn't the government doing something, but it was a government initiative that lit the fuse that caused what I think very productive, both in terms of increasing the speeds, but also, by the way, in terms of changing the way cities looked at deployment. So these things, I think, are much more complicated than the traditional tribal right-left kinds of stuff. So I have no problem just being cold-hearted and analytic about these things.
So I should say to everyone, the Free State Foundation is a partner of the videocast. They have no involvement in the selection of guests or the material or anything that go along with that. Randy's been a good friend, but he has no engagement in what I pick and what I do. And then separately, is I think I play the role you just might have mentioned, is objective asking questions and have no viewpoints on where you're going and commenting on whatever. I didn't filter that out for that purpose of I don't have those have viewpoints that may or may not share with yours. It may be much differently. So there. But I guess that gets.
Then it's okay if we do have different points of view.
Absolutely, no, that's completely fair. How much does policy? It depends on the subject matter, obviously. But how much does policy tend to change what Wall Street cares about? Is it a low? Is it a reasonable? Or is there high fascination on what happens in D.C. and that has an impact on X company or Y company? Or is it just matter on the moment and what's before the issue? If it's a merger, then therefore people care about what's happening in D.C. But the rest of the time, it just, it's kind of, to your point, noise.
Yeah. Wall Street cares basically about three things: revenues, margins, by which I mean cost structure, and opportunities. Policy sometimes changes those. Sometimes it doesn't. An investor once said to me, okay, here's what I want you to do. Stocks go up, stocks go down. Stocks go up, stocks go down. So here's the peak. Sometimes the government does something here that causes the stocks to go down. Sometimes the government does something here that causes the stock to go up. I want you to tell me 10 minutes before what happens. That's what I do. But if it's not affecting revenues, margins, and opportunities, it's just not that important. Brendan has made a big deal out of his delete proceeding. It's fine. There are some things that I wrote about before he started the proceeding, permitting and copper retirement in particular, where there are definitely benefits to the companies, but they're incremental. They're not big. It's not like dealing with EchoStar, where you see huge stock movements, or mergers and acquisitions, where you see huge movements based on perceptions of whether a merger will be approved or not approved. The delete proceeding, I express no view on whether it's good or bad. I'm just saying that it's not really relevant. I would be surprised if a CFO of any publicly traded company on a quarterly call said, our margins are better now because of the delete proceeding. Could be wrong about that, but I haven't found anyone who's told me that this one actually really helps. So I'm focused on revenues, margins, opportunities.
And so maybe that feeds into a similar question. Are there sectors that become no longer relevant? And I mentioned I used to go to New York in my previous job, and the broadcasting industry was of no interest to Wall Street.
Yeah.
They just didn't find any value and weren't any interested in buying. Now things are changed a little bit, maybe immediately, because there might be opportunities for movement and profit taking, but is there, it's very important in a policy perspective, but in the size and the scope of Wall Street, it's not. Do you find that am I thesis right?
No, you're totally right. Look, my value is a function of an equation, which is basically my value, V, equals market cap of the companies I cover, multiplied by a factor of volatility, multiplied by a factor of the government being responsible for that volatility. Broadcast stocks are incredibly small in the scope of things. And telecom, which was a huge percentage back in 2001, is now much smaller. Totally, basically, and I think this is something Washington doesn't understand. It looks at the stock market and says that it's up, and therefore things must be going well. It ignores a couple of big things. For example, no one on Wall Street ever sells before a rate cut. And if you think a rate cut is coming or another rate cut is coming, you probably don't want to be a seller. Second thing is, we are breaking records in stock buybacks. No one in Washington is focused on that. But that is an easy way to get your stock up. But the third and biggest and maybe most important, and there's been some attention to this, is you basically have the Magnificent Seven and you have the S&P 493. The Magnificent Seven are doing great. S&P 493 are not doing so well. But look, these things, it's interesting. If you look at the 5 biggest companies in our sector, what's happened since the beginning of the year? I think the S&P is up, 8%, 10%, something like that. Which, by the way, is lower than exchanges in other countries, but it's still what it is. AT&T is up, I think, 25+%. And I think that largely goes to they have had some improvements in performance and deleveraging and some other things. Verizon and T-Mobile are approximately the same as the S&P, a little bit less. Comcast and Charter are down a lot. Comcast, I think that's just about the fundamentals of losing, of cord cutting and things like that. Charter, there's a couple of other issues, but one of them is they had the largest number of ACP folks. And one of the things we were talking earlier about the tension, I was a big proponent, I testified to that ACP should be refunded. I always predicted it wouldn't be. So, you have to separate your hopes and aspirations from your sense of reality.
So then, maybe can you give us a flavor of what do you think that Wall Street cares about today? Is it mergers? Is there particular policies that they care about without undermining any of your work?
Yeah. So I would say, Wall Street obviously cared about tax cuts. They care about AI a lot, and to the extent that there are companies who get the glow of AI, they get a certain benefit. And it's interesting because AI is dependent on telecom, but telecom hasn't really gotten an AI lift, and there's a question of whether they'll get it. I think what Wall Street cares about, the biggest thing they cared about was Dish and what happens to its spectrum. That by far is the biggest thing. And I think we now have a good thing. Spectrum is always an issue. The CBRS spectrum for the cable players is something that's interesting. The biggest debates in our sector, in the telecom, are not primarily policy, but they can be affected by policy. There's the question of whether Carr is right that satellite will compete with mobile. Again, most Wall Street now doesn't believe it will, but if the perception changes, spectrum issues related to satellite and some of the other proceedings will become much more important. The BEAD program was important, and it still could be, particularly if the states get to keep the 20+ billion that is not for deployment but can be used for other things. That can lead to investments that the telecom sector can benefit from. One of the biggest debates is about fixed wireless. There's no question that fixed wireless is taking market share from wired guys. The question is it going like this? Is it going like this? Or is it going like this? Big debate about that. We could just go down a rabbit hole, but it's affected by policy in terms of spectrum policy in particular. And the Dish deal with AT&T allows AT&T to increase its fixed wireless thing. So I would say we are not, policy is more Rosencrantz and Guildenstern than it is Hamlet, which, on a personal level is appropriate because I always thought of myself more like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern than Hamlet. But Wall Street cares about a lot of different things. Policy plays into it, but I wouldn't say there's a central thing. It's very different than the implementation of the 96 Act, where Wall Street cared a huge amount because the way that Reed did it and Bill did it and Michael did it and Kevin did it, big impacts.
So maybe I've asked this question of a number of people, as you've worked at and now monitor or watch or follow the FCC, has its significance in the overall marketplace shrunk as issues have grown outside of, traditional telecom? The rise of most tech companies are outside its purview. AI, unless Congress has, makes a complete, shift, is going to be outside its purview. There's going to be so much more of the universe is outside as technology, as telecom is shrinking, and sectors are splintering off in their traditional businesses. Is the FCC, long for the world?
It's a great question. I would say, when I got to the FCC in 1993, what characterized the market were single-purpose analog networks that had huge moats. You had the cable industry offering multi-channel video. You didn't really have DirecTV and Dish yet. You had wired telephone, and you had mobile telephone that was very, very small. And you had some data networks that were really small. What happened, and I think we were in some part responsible, but it was also driven by technology, of course, was everything changed into digital networks that compete with each other, all delivering voice, video, and data. And that is a massive historic change. What I would say about the FCC is that, remember, the only major domestic piece of regulatory legislation in the Clinton era was the '96 Telecom Act, and you know that both of us have a history with that. That was really big and really dramatic, and the market cared a lot about it. And you had the rise of the internet, and you had the rise of fiber. And by the way, a lot of people have compared what's going on with AI similar to what was happening with fiber. And there are some parallels, including that there will be an overinvestment, as there was in computers and cars and railroads and every new technology. Well, there was a consensus that the path forward and the role of the FCC was faster, better, cheaper communications through competition. There was disagreements on the tactics, but fundamentally, that was the role of the FCC. In 2009 and 10, I think there was an understanding that the world had shifted from fundamentally voice networks to broadband networks. And this was what the National Broadband Plan was about. How do we get networks everywhere? How do we get everybody on them? And importantly, how do we use them better to deliver essential public goods and services, better outcomes, lower costs? I would say that we are well on our way to solving problem number one. We are not well on our way to solving problem number two. Whether the FCC wants to play a major role in this, I don't know. I think the FCC under the Democrats was quite ineffective in arguing for why the ACP should be renewed. I think they focused on the wrong issues. And despite Jessica having great experience in the Congress, she was not an effective advocate in my view for that. But I don't know that the Republicans care enough. So that's a lingering problem. The biggest issue, in my opinion, for the government is how do you use broadband networks and AI to improve how you actually deliver healthcare, education, et cetera, public safety, et cetera. I think we're actually behind in that. I might note that I thought DOGE had an opportunity to really do that. It did not. It was not focused on that at all. And that's a tragedy to me. What is the role of the FCC at this point? Because in a way we're kind of at an end stage of a 30-year end stage from how markets operated or how networks operated to now. The FCC, I think, has some important things it could be doing. I think cybersecurity will be an important thing. And whether it's at the FCC or somewhere else, you can argue about. I think the FCC has a better position to do things on that. I think there are certain things related to AI that it can do. I am skeptical that they will be successful or that they should be successful in preempting state laws. I don't think courts will actually allow them to do that. I did a long note on that. We could go into that. But I think the fundamental challenge remains making sure that all Americans are on. And I don't think the FCC, in a way it's tragic, in another way it's comical. Every chair seems to believe that they can kick USF reform to the next chair. You know, Ajit, the contribution factor doubled while he was there. He never talked about it, except on his way out saying, oh, we probably should do something. Jessica managed to never do anything other than her report, which was not a good, the FCC is capable of very good work. It was not a good work, her report. And Brendan, I don't think he's talked about USF once. We're almost at 40% of the contribution factor, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it's really about the actual cost. But my point is, the Universal Service Program is the biggest thing the FCC does. It's wildly out of date on both the contribution and distribution side, and there is no debate internally that will help inform Congress about what to do. So I think that's a big issue. There are some other issues, but I think the big legacy will be you're going to have broadcast consolidation. That's going to put pressure on MVPDs. It's also, by the way, I think going to provide incentives for the content companies to move content to non-broadcast platforms, which is exactly the opposite of what Carr wants to have happen, but I think his own actions will cause that to accelerate. He will not be the person to, shall we say, find out that there are unintended consequences of his action that are not what he wants. One of the things that cracks me up about DC is everybody in DC seems to believe that if you give companies something that they want, like a tax break, they will spend the money precisely the way the person in DC wants to do it. So Brendan is saying, for example, if we allow consolidation and get these really big national affiliate groups, we're going to have more local content. I don't know why he thinks that. I mean, that's not an argument. What I'm saying is not an argument against allowing them to consolidate, because there are lots of different arguments you can make. But I don't know why they're going to spend more money on local news. That is totally counterintuitive to me. And it's, you know, the thing about Wall Street is they also want the companies to spend money in the ways that they want. And without knowing any other facts, the odds of Wall Street winning that versus DC are like 90%. In other words, they'll spend it on stock buybacks. They'll spend it on, you know, mergers. They'll spend it the way they want to spend it, not the way DC people want them to spend it.
Last question, and maybe it ties into that, and I again reiterate, I have no views aligning myself or disassociating or involving myself in your analysis of the current chairman. Mm-hmm. But is there, do you have any comment or thought on the idea that the FCC is an independent entity or is part of the executive branch, and what is the ramifications for that, maybe putting on your old hat without any thoughts?
So yeah, I would prefer it be an independent agency. I think it has a lot of expertise. I think on things like, you know, spectrum auctions, the agency has been spectacular. We led the world in how we did this. It was highly controversial when we first did it. It not only, the staff has essentially been involved in 2 Nobel Prize winning, they've also won Oscars and Emmys. I mean, it's been fantastic. That's the kind of expertise. You don't want that saying, let's shift the way we do spectrum auctions to favor a favorite company, right? Yeah, you really don't want that kind of thing. There are a variety of ways in which I would prefer to be independent. Let me tell you a story, a true story, that only exists when you have an independent agency. In the run-up to the '96 Act, one of the big questions was, how do we do the digital television transition? What the broadcasters wanted was, we have 6 megahertz of spectrum for analog, we need 6 megahertz for digital, and we should just be allowed to keep both for a short temporary period of 30 years. Reed and I thought that was a very bad idea. But unfortunately, the broadcasters convinced both Clinton and Newt Gingrich that it was a very good idea. And they were about to put big pressure on us, and we got advance warning that it was coming. So we went to Bill Safire, a columnist at the New York Times, former speechwriter for Nixon, and Reed literally said, help us, Obi-Wan Safire, you're our only hope. Here's here's why we need to get the spectrum back much faster, but here's also the opportunity for digital television, etc. And Bill wrote a fantastic editorial that did everything we wanted. And Rita and I were just like, oh my God, we've been trying to figure out how to articulate this. And he just took a day and did it so much better than we've ever done it. I then called up Max Boot, who, and now at the Post, but was then at the Wall Street Journal, who'd written many editorials critical of Reed, and said, Max, you've written these critical editorials. Again, I'm not going to argue about those things. But on this issue, you should be with us. This is about free markets. This is about letting new opportunities flourish. Max wrote a fantastic editorial entitled Gingrich Giveaway. This led to Bob Dole, John McCain, Barney Frank, Reed, and a few other folks, a really weird coalition, all kind of saying, no, we want the spectrum back. And ultimately we compromised on 10 years, and then it turned out to be 12 years. But here's my point. If you had an FCC chair who said, I just do what the White House tells me to do, the White House didn't understand all the implications of holding up that spectrum in the broadcast arena. And that was a really important thing we did. And getting that spectrum back, I think, was really important for the country. So that's just an example of how, yeah, everybody's political, and you don't want to, you don't screw the person who appointed you, but you should have an independent view.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Blair, sorry. Blair, I can't thank you. You're second nature to him. So look, I can't thank you enough for your vision here and sharing your thoughts, and we'll go from there. Thanks again for your time.
Great, thank you.
Appreciate it.